Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. As U.S.-Russia relations remain in a deep freeze, Europe is taking a different path when it comes to Russia. Some are calling it the new thaw. Also, China calls out the UK regarding Hong Kong. Indeed, old colonial habits die hard. Cross-talking some real news, I'm joined by my guest here in Moscow, Glenn Deason. He is a professor at the Higher School of Economics, as well as author of The Decay of Western Civilization and the Resurgence of Russia. And we're also joined by Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to Marcus in London. An interesting phenomenon that's been going on now for a number of months, or maybe since the election of Donald Trump. But we have, we just recently had Vladimir Putin in Italy meeting the Pope and Italian leaders. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, not that I'm a big fan of the organization, has finally given the Russian delegation its voting rights back and other elements that have to do with their membership. Germany is determined that the Nord Stream 2 will be finished, the gas pipeline. We have President Macron speaking very bluntly that Europe needs a better relationship with Russia. I mean, add this all up, it is a thaw of some sorts, isn't it? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, Peter, I believe that there is a distinct possibility that once Britain exits the European Union, then Brussels and Moscow could improve their relationship. Now, why is that? Well, firstly, Britain has long been perceived by many in Paris and Berlin as America's Trojan horse. Britain relays sensitive information from what is discussed in the European Union to Washington. Secondly, it was the efforts, it was the lobbying on behalf of America by Britain in 2014 that put enormous pressure on the Germans and the French to put EU sanctions on Russia. The Germans and the French and the Italians have very good relationships with Russia, and they did not want to place those sanctions. But because of Britain, in part, they relented and they placed those sanctions on Russia. Now, in 2019, Britain is scheduled to leave the EU, and one way or another it will. That is where there will be an opportunity for Russia and the European Union to improve their relations. And it certainly is in the interests of the EU to improve relations with Russia. Why? Because of the massive amounts of trade and investment between the European Union and Russia. And also the EU does not want to be on the front line of a potential war because of America and also its sidekick, Britain.
You were saying this to me earlier here. I mean, when the European Union deals with Russia, the British like to always be first in line to have a hard line. With Brexit coming right now, the French, the Germans, the Italians, maybe not necessarily like countries like Poland or the Baltic republics, but they're beginning to realize that there's going to be a new page that has to be turned here, and they want to take the initiative. They want to be able to propose, instead of just having to deal with ending American sanctions, which, as Marcus pointed out, was never really particularly popular on the continent.
Yeah, and I think there's also a sentiment now that the sanctions will sooner or later fall apart because there's growing opposition to it, and with the British leaving as well, I think there's an interest now to negotiate how this confrontation will end rather than simply be forced to see the sanction fall apart. So at least, use it in some form of negotiations. But I think a big part of this is also increasing recognition that sanctions have failed, because sanctions, you use sanctions
it's cost the European Union far more than it has Russia.
Yeah, very much so. But the sanctions are put in for two reasons. The first would be you want to change the policy behavior of the other side. But in this instance, what tends to be neglected is that the West West who has acted as the revisionist power, and Russia has been the status quo. That is, it reacted to the toppling in Ukraine, so it held on to the territory, well, the position it already had in places like Crimea. It stopped the West from toppling governments in Syria to Venezuela. So by being the status quo power, if you want them to change their behavior, it's essentially asking them for surrender. So not stand in the way of Western expansionism. So Russia essentially has drawn this red line and just try to be patient. So you can't really do much in that aspect. And the second purpose would be simply to punish Russia, to weaken its economy and relegate it into irrelevance. But the problem here is it would have worked 20 years ago, but now Russia is looking towards China and other partners in the East. So it's diversifying its technologies, its industries, transportation corridors.
Import substitution.
Yeah, import substitution, also developing its own capabilities, diversifying its use of currencies, transaction systems, development banks. So across the board, economic connectivity with the West is broken. So now, coming to the recognition, we can't simply have this escalation dominance where we one day can choose to re-establish relations with Russia, because a lot of this trade, a lot of this economic connectivity is already lost and it's gone to the Chinese. So it's there is time to reconsider, what have we actually done here, what have we achieved, and look for a better path. So
let's go back to London. Marcus, I mean, how much is this a reaction to Donald Trump, this thaw that's coming into play here? I mean, we see the United States with Donald Trump demanding that Europe relegate its energy security to the whims of American energy companies, which, of course, leaders like Angela Merkel, as she goes out the door, the people that will, the woman that will follow her is going to have the same thing, because Germany is defending its national interests. I mean, this is some kind of tipping point right now where the Europeans are realizing they have to defend their national interests, because their national interest is not being defended by the United States. Actually, just the opposite, eroding their national interests. Marcus in London.
Well, stemming from the Ukraine crisis in 2014, relations between the European Union and America then became tense, even under Barack Obama. But it is absolutely true to say that since Donald Trump entered the White House, that tense relationship between Brussels and Washington has been aggravated all the more so. And in a peculiar way, Donald Trump has actually pushed the European Union closer to Russia. The European Union really shot itself in the foot by placing those sanctions on Russia in 2014. I held the view then, and I still hold the view today, that those EU sanctions would cause short-term pain for Russia, and they did. But in the long term, it gave an opportunity to the domestic Russian market, which was important. But for the domestic markets in the European Union, they are still suffering from not being able to.
Ask Polish apple farmers. Ask them what happened to them. Okay, exactly. Glenn, I mean, I have been, in a bizarre way, actually been a supporter of the sanctions because of the reasons that Marcus just told us. I mean, having lived here for so long, and up to 2014, I heard successive governments saying we need reform, we need to modernize, we need to do so many things. In 2014, the gauntlet was thrown down. They had to do all of those things that Marcus just told us. This has made Russia stronger, and Russia's position is stronger. And interestingly, as Marcus pointed out, U.S. policy is driving China and Russia together, and as we say on this program here, it's pushing Europe to be closer to Russia. This is a net fail for the United States if they wanted to take on China and Russia and the European Union all at the same time. As Trump said, Bolton wants to fight wars simultaneously all over the world. Okay, that's a losing proposition.
Yeah, but also in 2014, when the U.S. was able to put pressure and convince Europe to. But that was by their own words, by the way, to twist Europe's arm in order to accept sanctions on Russia. This was under the Obama administration, which was more measured. Now, since then, what has happened? Well, The Americans are pushing the Europeans, well, trying to twist their arm again to go against a trade war against the Chinese. They're pushing them to target the Iranians to break the treaty. They also try to get them aboard with Venezuela, which hasn't really panned out very well. So, and also now, of course, putting sanctions against the Europeans themselves, or at least raising tariffs. So it's all this new front line. So I think for the Europeans to keep open the front line against Russia, in unity with the United States, I think it's as you correctly pointed out, I think it's less appealing now than it was in the past, and in regards to the benefits of Russia, I tend to agree with that as well. Like, it's been painful for Russia as well, the sanctions. A lot of investments that should have been making hasn't been made, but on the silver lining would be that Russia it kind of de-industrialized, as became too dependent on exports of natural resources and simply became too convenient to import and manufacture goods, develop technologies.
Complacently, there was a lot of complacence.
Yeah, very much so. And now you see that Russia has been forced to reverse this, to develop its own industries, to modernize. So to a large extent, this has been quite beneficial. It was very hard to get the business community on board to do these painful reforms. But now, thanks to the Europeans and the Americans, these reforms were essentially forced upon Russia, and a lot of good has been achieved now. A lot of industries that didn't have in the past are now growing. So,
okay, we give 30 seconds to Marcus. Finish it off. Go ahead.
Whilst there is a distinct possibility of an improvement in relations between the EU and Russia, one must never underestimate the enormous American leverage over the European Union. It's economic and security. So the Americans have the potential to scupper any chance of an improvement in relations between the EU and Russia.
Well, I'm not that pessimistic here. I think there's a lot of things in play here. All right, we've run out of time here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team.
So the temporary orders that I'm under before we go to final trial actually do allow me to address him as James and use male pronouns, but I cannot do that in front of third parties who know him as a girl. So basically, I can't go to his school. I keep him away from any friends he might have at school that know him as a girl. And at my home, he's known as James, and I use male pronouns. What I'm prohibited from doing right now is trying to convince him that he's actually a boy.
Я сюда приехал попробовать нырнуть на пределе своих возможностей. Я не люблю холод. Это как бы небольшой такой вызов попробовать как нырять в ледяной воде. Вот Тут парень, который побил мировой рекорд, нырнул 75 метров. Мне надо нырять 76.
3, 2, 1, старт!
Welcome to Max Kaiser's Financial Survival Guide. Looking forward to your pension account? Huh, yikes! This is what happens to pensions in Britain. Don't let this happen to you. Watch Kaiser report.
When lawmakers manufacture consent instead of public wealth. When the ruling classes protect only themselves. When the financial merry-go-round lifts only the 1% up. It's time to ignore middle-of-the-road signals. Going underground, bringing real news to Britain and the world.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Referring to what's going on in Hong Kong. Just refresh our memory here. What was democracy like in Hong Kong when it was a colony of the UK? Go ahead.
Well, the response of the British government to the violent protests in Hong Kong is a reminder that the British imperial mindset did not die with the British Empire. And what an inverted world we live in today, Peter, where Britain, which committed some of the worst genocides in living history, such as the Native Americans, such as the Irish, such as the Aborigine, and whose politicians and journalists today, both conservative and liberal alike, are genocide deniers, are lecturing China about human rights in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an integral part of China, but it was once a British colony. And let's just remember, Peter, how the British acquired Hong Kong.
Yep.
They acquired this Chinese region through the First Opium War, in which the British Empire went to war against China in order to achieve two objectives, namely to flood the Chinese market with opium and to steal Chinese territories. So there is no reason why anyone in China should take any lectures about human rights from British politicians and British journalists. And let's just look at what those protesters in Hong Kong are protesting about. A bill which will see people who have committed crimes in Hong Kong sent to the mainland for trial. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. If someone commits a crime in Jersey or in Guernsey, then they could well be sent to the British mainland for trial. You know, the Channel Islands are part of Britain. Hong Kong is part of China. What happens in Hong Kong is an internal Chinese matter and has nothing to do with anyone.
Well, but British politicians seem to feel differently. Glenn, what I find, I'm all for peaceful protest, absolutely, okay? And I'd like to point out that the protests of the yellow vests are treated much more harshly than the protesters in Hong Kong, maybe a topic for another program here. But you have these protesters breaking into Parliament violently, and then they hoist the colonial flag. What is going on with that?
Yeah, well, it's... that obviously goes beyond what you would call peaceful protests. And I guess that's, again, where some of this hypocrisy comes in. You mentioned France, but you also had the incident in Catalonia where they actually, people had their heads cracked open for wanting to vote. So in Europe, we have our own issues as well. And all of this started, of course, with the extradition bill that Hong Kong citizens can be extradited to mainland China, but in the European Union you have similar extradition, and these are between actual states, while this happens internally within China. So there is obviously some hypocrisy there, but it also goes back to the way you frame the language, because when we talk about what happened in France, we talk about rioters. When we talk about Hong Kong, they're protesters. But obviously, the second they broke in and stormed Parliament, the protester...
But what about the flag thing? That's what I don't get, okay? I mean, it is universally, internationally recognized as a one country. We have these two systems, one country. And is this a call to return to colonial rule?
Well, I guess that made it more inappropriate for the British to respond, because by hoisting the British colonial flag, obviously that's a challenge to the return of Britain's colonial possession and returning it back to China. So for the British...
but they didn't have democracy. They were a colony, okay?
Yes.
I mean, this is remarkable. Let me go back to Marcus here. I mean, this is what I find bewildering here. I mean, these protesters, some of them very violent, are calling for a modicum of democracy or rule of law, everything that you and I could agree on here. But they want to look back to the colonial period. Well, explain to me how democratic Hong Kong was under the British. I think our viewers would like to know.
Well, in terms of how democratic Hong Kong was when it was a British imperial possession, it's quite simple. The people in Hong Kong were dictated to by London. Yes, of course, the British, they built an economic infrastructure in Hong Kong. They introduced a civil service, but that was only to appease people in Hong Kong who were serving the British, what London wanted at the end of the day was always implemented at the end of the day in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is a Chinese territory, and it was savagely taken away by the British from China. And these politicians and journalists in Britain who are coming to the aid of those violent protesters, well, I have a question for them. How would they respond if protesters forcibly entered the House of Commons and ransacked it? I don't think they would be showing any sympathy to them. There is no difference whatsoever. What happened in Hong Kong, and as you said, Peter, I'm all in favour of peaceful protests, but those protests were violent. They showed no respect for Chinese law. They showed no respect for the Parliament's building. And also, as you rightly said, I thought it was very telling how those violent protesters unveiled to the rest of the world Hong Kong's British colonial era flag.
Okay. You know, Glenn, but this is really a function of domestic British politics here, okay? And looking back to a different era, okay, of British rule and colonial rule. I mean, they're hearkening back to this. I mean, this is this an internal political affair for the Conservative Party?
Well, yeah, I think for two reasons. One is you have that internal power battle now for who's going to be the next prime minister, and I think the fact that Jeremy Hunt's the one who went forward, it's quite telling because he doesn't really have a chance against Boris Johnson. So unless he really stands out as this great statesman, so I think for him to kind of elevate Britain up there, putting China in his place,
elevate British imperialism.
Yeah, and
is that a winner?
And I guess that's a second appeal, which would be in Britain at the moment. There is this sense of relative decline. They do have. They are trying to find their new place in the world, especially now
with Brexit.
With Brexit. So, are they going to, be relevant in the years to come? So, I guess bringing Britain back to greatness. What better example than take them back to the Opium Wars when they essentially could tell China what to do and assert their sovereignty over Chinese territory. So. I would agree. There's probably some colonial mindset there still ruling. I would agree that they do have this treaty in terms of the transition. China, in 50 years, they should gradually transition as they were supposed to have a certain autonomy. Obviously, China wants to speed this up to bring them
because it's a unitary state.
Yes, you don't want them to drift away. So you want them to integrate the country further. Faster, while Britain obviously seeks to possibly slow it down and even harness some loyalties within Hong Kong towards British rule as opposed to from Beijing. So there's the colonial aspect there, definitely, you can't deny it. It's
let me go back to Marcus in London. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of the reaction, particularly in the media, is that the legitimacy of Chinese sovereignty is in question, which is unthinkable for Beijing. That their sovereignty is of less value somehow than Western sovereignty, the UK, for example. Marcus.
Well, let me make an observation to you, Peter. I have long held the view that this sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority is not just embedded in the Conservative camp in Britain, it is also embedded in the Liberal camp in Britain. The Conservative Party, its politicians and its members hold very dear to the British Empire. The Liberal camp, of course, it likes to criticise the British Empire in some respects, but when it comes to a country like China, they will always play up what they think is the best form of rule for the former British colony of Hong Kong, and that is a British system. So that just reinforces a long-held view of mine that this sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority runs through the veins of liberals and conservatives alike in Britain.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, advocating for common human rights, a common humanity, if you want, irrespective of national borders. There's some virtue to this, obviously, to stand up for the democracy and civil rights of others. But the problem is, it's also very instrumental to undermine the sovereignty of other states. And let's not forget, in Chinese regions like Tibet, the CIA was operating there for 2 decades, and the objective was quite
Dalai
clear.
Lama and his brother on the CIA's payroll, common knowledge.
Yeah, and the idea was to uphold autonomy and even push for independence. Now, this wasn't, because their love for Tibetan culture and thing. It was because it's a tool to weaken an adversary. So they only ended this in '72 when they were resetting relations with China under Kissinger for using against the Soviet Union. So like all this claim calls for democracy, you obviously have that underlying power interest driving it at the end of the day. And so evidently, the reason why we would criticize Chinese transgressions so much more easy than the Western ones, it's usually not because the extent of the violations of human rights, rather it would be more the power interest. That is, and I think that's definitely what's driving this.
Okay, we go back to London. Marcus, 40 seconds. Go to you. We'll finish it off. Go ahead.
Well, there are a number of areas in China that both the Americans and the British see as an Achilles heel of the country. And another one is the Xinjiang province, which is a mainly Muslim province, which has a problem with Islamist terrorists. And the Chinese officials I have spoken to are quite aware that the Americans and the British are supporting separatist Islamist groups in that region as a way of trying to weaken the Chinese economy and thereby weaken the hold of the Communist Party in China.
Okay, we ended up on that note there. That's all the time we have here. Many thanks to my guests, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.